Hey, Medical Wildcats, and Happy New Year. I'm Joseph Guggenheim. I'm a 1972 alum of the medical school, and this month I'm doing part 2 of my series on water in Chicago. Has it been a blessing or a curse? According to the New York Times, water is why Chicago exists, and by traversing a small dip in the Continental Divide, Chicago was transformed from a swampy village to a major business metropolis. Early Chicago's history is tied to water, including the elimination of waterborne diseases such as typhoid fever, dysentery, and cholera. The large population explosion. Chicago was the fastest growing city in the United States in the 19th century, and the need for adequate garbage and sewer management. Before Chicago was a city, the local Miami people lived near Chicago, and they showed the French explorers Marquette and Joliet a passage where they could save time by going from the Mississippi watershed to the Lake Michigan watershed. Marquette and Joliet were traveling north from the area which is now Arkansas, and were looking to try to get to Green Bay, Wisconsin. But the local Miami people showed them a valuable shortcut. They showed them a shortcut that they had been using for many decades. It was a low area in the subcontinental divide, just west of the southwest corner of Lake Michigan. Joliet immediately recognized that this shortcut could accelerate the travel between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. This is shown in this map on the right. As the red line bifurcates going north, you can see the shortcut right at the southern end of Lake Michigan, or the long way of going all the way up to the tip of Wisconsin and then coming south again to Green Bay. This was known as the Chicago Portage, and it became a popular route for British and French fur traders and missionaries. It got its name because the native people were portaging their boats over this area in order to get to Lake Michigan. This was called a subcontinental divide. It was about 12 miles from the lakeshore. It was a very gentle 8-foot rise in the elevation and almost imperceptible, but it would get swampy after a heavy rain. Water flows away from the subcontinental divide. The water east of it flows east to Lake Michigan, as shown in the green arrows, and west, it flows westward, as shown in the red arrows, toward the Des Plaines River and eventually to the Mississippi watershed. A canal was built over this portage site called the Illinois and Michigan Canal. This was built to connect Lake Michigan to the Chicago River and then to the Illinois River and ultimately to the Mississippi River. It was 96 miles long. It was built to float boats, but not for drainage of Chicago or a source of fresh water. It followed the path that the Native Americans had been using for generations. Groundbreaking occurred in 1835, and it took over 12 years to build this canal. It was opened in 1848. It was built largely by enslaved Black migrants from the South and immigrants, largely from Ireland. They worked up to 15 hours each day, and they were paid $1 a day and a pint of whiskey. Many died from malaria and from accidents. They suffered from anti-immigrant sentiment, especially the Irish. The canal, after it was finished, was only 60 feet wide, 2/3 of the distance between home plate and first base in baseball, and only 6 feet deep. And you can see here at this lock that the canal narrows down even more. The locks and aqueducts were built to cover the 140-foot elevation difference between Lake Michigan and the Illinois River. After it was completed, Chicago now had access to the more markets, both by water and by land by the railroads and water by the ships. Land prices along the canal soared, as well as commerce increased. But there were problems. Chicago still didn't have a source of fresh water, clean fresh water, and sewage disposal. The Illinois and Michigan Canal benefited commerce, but Chicago still had a sewage and drinking water problem. Ellis Chesbro was a self-trained engineer brought from Boston in 1855 to solve these problems. Chesbro had 3 plans. His first plan was to elevate the buildings on jacks, as seen in this picture of elevating the Briggs Hotel. Multiple jacks designed by George Pullman of the Pullman train car fame were placed underneath the building, and the building was elevated and then held in the elevated position with dredgings from Lake Michigan. This allowed the elevation of the building so that sewage from the building would flow downhill to the lake or to the river instead of just being thrown in the street. But now this came up with this made another problem develop, and that was contamination of Lake Michigan. So Chesbro came up with a second plan, and that was to move the water intake source far out in the lake, away from the waste egress pipes at the shoreline. The basis for this was that the solution to pollution is dilution. By the time the sewage got out to the intake source, the contamination would be so dilute that it would not affect the drinking water. Intake cribs were built 2 to 4 miles from the shoreline, and some of these are still visible from the Lake Michigan shore near the med school. That didn't work either, because there was a big storm in about 1885, which threatened the water supply at the intake cribs. And Chicago knew it was only a matter of time before a bigger storm would come and do disastrous damage to the intake supply. So Chesbro's third plan was to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. This was done by connecting the Illinois and Michigan Canal to drain the sewage away from the city. In 1871, during a period of particularly low water, the city pumped water from the Chicago River into the canal, and the workers were astonished that the sewage flowed away from Lake Michigan. But Chesbro died in 1886. In 1887, the city decided to permanently reverse the river. But the canal was not deep enough to carry the load, so a new canal had to be built. And this was the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, which was started in 1892. The theory was that if you could dig deep enough, basically under the subcontinental divide, the gravity would pull the water flow west away from the city. And the picture on the right shows some of the equipment that was used to go through the solid rock in this area. The new canal was deeper and wider than the old I&M Canal. It followed basically the same path. It was 31 miles long, 26 feet deep, as opposed to 6 feet deep, like the I&M Canal, and 202 feet wide instead of 60 like the other canal, and it became wider as it went west. It would connect the south branch of the Chicago River at Bridgeport with the Des Plaines River near Joliet, which was on the other side of the subcontinental divide. And these two maps show the effect. In the picture on the left, you can see the north and south branch of the Chicago River draining into the main branch and eventually into Lake Michigan, and then the Calumet River draining into Lake Michigan. After the reversal with the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, the north and main branch of the Chicago River drained into the south branch, eventually to the Des Plaines River, and the Calumet River drained eventually into the Des Plaines River also. In this close-up of that map, you can see at the on the right side, the south branch of the Chicago River at the purple arrow is now draining into the canal at Bridgeport, as also seen in the purple arrow on the right. The canal drains toward Joliet, as seen at the purple arrow on the left side, and then eventually to the Mississippi. Workers had to excavate 42 million cubic yards of rock and soil. This was more debris than had been excavated for the Panama Canal. They developed a new method of earth moving called the Chicago School of Earth Moving, and it was used to build the Panama Canal. There were more than 250 workers and spectators killed at the construction site. You may wonder why spectators were killed. Well, it's considered good entertainment to go out and watch the workers dig. But, and especially during the 1893 World's Fair, it attracted a lot of people. But it was almost as dangerous to be a spectator as it was to be a worker. Cities downstream, such as Memphis and St. Louis, objected to Chicago dumping sewage into the Mississippi River. And this was debated in a Supreme Court case. The canal trustees broke through the earthen dam that was frozen solid because of the ice on January 2nd, 1900. They realized that once the river had been reversed, there was no holding it back. So it was demolished in secrecy with picks and shovels on the early morning, January 2nd, 1900. It was attempted to be done in secrecy, but the local residents spotted it and went out to watch and called the press, and they came and photographed it. And this is one of their pictures. Reversing the river caused objections downstream. Landowners along the Illinois River complained their land was being flooded and their farms were now being called frog ranches. Memphis and St. Louis downstream on the Mississippi did not want Chicago's sewage coming their way, and they challenged the case in the Supreme Court, but they lost. They could not prove that contamination of the river was originating in Chicago. The St. Louis baseball team called the Chicago National League team the Chicago Microbes. But as I said, St. Louis failed to prove that pollution was the cause of was being caused by reversal of the river. A biologist report said that 60 miles southwest of Chicago, the water was grayish and sloppy with foul, privy odors. Putrescent masses of soft, graying or blackish, slimy matter loosely held together by threads of fungi were floating down the stream. Sounds pretty bad. Neighboring states were concerned about Illinois' diversion of fresh water. They were taking water out of Lake Michigan at an unheard of rate. The Supreme Court ruled against Chicago in 1930, ordering the locks and dams to control the diversion. Chicago now pre-treats 1.3 billion gallons of sewage every day before dumping it into the canal. And this includes disinfection. The river is now cleaner than it has been in 150 years. 20 to 30 years ago, when a lot of us were in the med school, people would not walk along the Riverwalk. It was so dirty and smelly. But it is now a tourist attraction with restaurants, bars, and people canoeing and kayaking. Can you swim in the Chicago River? Yes, you can, but I wouldn't advise it. And now new problems are arising. The same water that gave Chicago its life is now threatening its future. The engineering triumph of reversing the river for the elimination of sewage has caused unforeseen problems. And climate change is blamed for storms, and the city is probably unprepared for them to be getting even worse over the coming years. There have been some unforeseen problems. There's now a biological hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The river is not simply a body of water, but is a underwater ecosystem. And reversal of the river has caused hypoxia in this area in the Gulf of Mexico, south of Texas and Louisiana, and all the way over to the mouth of the Mississippi. Sewage from other cities has contributed to this zone, but Chicago is the biggest contributor. Heavy rains and increasing sewage usage due to the population growth has caused the system to be overflowing. And when it really rains, locks and gates were built to slow the flow of Lake Michigan water into the river, but they are being thrown open, and the flooded river releases its sewage directly into the lake. In other words, the river is being reversed or reverted back to the original direction. And that is just a temporary thing. But it occurred over 100 times each year by the late 1960s, and it has occurred recently as a heavy rain in July 2023. To mitigate this problem, a system of deep tunnels and storage reservoirs have been built to hold the excessive water to slow its release into the canal. And this is a picture of them. The one on the left is one of these storage tanks 300 feet below the surface, and you can see it's 33 feet in diameter, and to get the scale, you can see the man standing in the lower part of the tank. On the right, there are the open lagoons along the canal. There's a harbor lock at the Chicago waterfront, and this is a set of steel gates separating the Mississippi River from Lake Michigan. It serves as a man-made continental divide with hinges, and it can be opened and closed as needed. It is controversial whether the river should be re-reversed. Are the new problems worse than the original problems? It's been temporarily reversed several times following heavy rains to avoid the flooding of the city. But climate change may increase the frequency of these threatening floods. And now non-native aquatic flora and fauna are threatening the Lake Michigan. From the south, it is occurring upstream along the Mississippi, from the east occurring down the St. Lawrence Seaway, and has already triggered botulism outbreaks in birds, killing thousands. 17 attorneys general of nearby states are demanding the federal government stop Chicago from damaging the ecosystem and allowing the invasion of non-native species. Asian carp, which is a fish that is native to Eastern Europe and Asia, have invaded the Mississippi River and are threatening the Lake Michigan. They're voracious eaters, heavy spawners, and have no natural enemies. They weigh up to 100 pounds. It is thought that their invasion into Lake Michigan could threaten the fishing industry. I was in the Czech Republic one year, and carp are considered a delicacy there, and it was one of the worst fish I've ever eaten. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has several proposals to keep carp out of Lake Michigan. Some of them are, two of them are very expensive and will take many years to build. Electric barriers to jolt approaching fish is only a temporary solution. So what does the future hold? Well, Chicago is the can-do city, and I am quite confident that they will come up with a solution for this. Let's get together again next month virtually. And in the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to our virtual meeting next month. Thank you.